Greece makes a conservative U-turn after a decade of austerity. Will a new prime minister from the country's old guard end the economic troubles? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Alexis Tsipras was supposed to be the political outsider, a man who would pull Greece's poor out from under the boot of the European Union. But on Sunday, voters declared he was not, handing a landslide victory to his rival. When Tsipras was first elected, he immediately upset his supporters by bending the knee to the EU's austerity measures. And more recently, he enraged his critics by signing a controversial deal that allowed Greece's neighbors to call themselves North Macedonia. So with New Democracy back in power, the party says it's time for a change. And economists are keen to see if Kyriakos Mitsotakis can deliver. After all, he says he can turn the Greek economy around, privatize businesses and create jobs. But with the worst rate of unemployment in the Eurobloc, is Mitsotakis' promise of change just another instance of prime ministers overpromising? Melinda Nusifora has been covering the story from Athens and has this report.
A new day and a new democracy in Greece.
Θέλω μια Ελλάδα ισχυρή με αυτοπεποίθηση να διεκδικεί στην Ευρώπη αυτά που της αξίζουν και να μην είναι επέτης και φτωχός συγγενής.
The New Democracy Party secured a landslide win in Greece's weekend election. But if it wants to pull off that kind of economic turnaround, it has no time to waste. It's been almost a year since the country emerged from a regime of bailouts and austerity measures from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. But Greece is still struggling. Unemployment remains the highest in the EU at 18%, and the minimum wage is one of the lowest at just over $700 a month.
Νομίζω ότι ο νέος πρωθυπουργός
I believe that the new prime minister doesn't have much of a choice, and the country doesn't have much of a choice either. Greece has to break free from this inertia.
να ξεφύγει από αυτή.
Just 15 hours after delivering his victory speech, Kyriakos Mitsotakis was in his new office, accepting a handover of power from predecessor Alexis Tsipras. The PM has repeatedly declared it's time to roll up his sleeves and get to work. Economists say his top priority must be visionary economic reform to show that Greece is open for business.
The biggest ally of this government, and at the same time its biggest opponent, is time. I believe the government, within the first 3 or 4 months, should take initiatives and make reforms in order to send a strong message to domestic and international investors.
Mitsotakis' resounding win signalled what some called an end to left-wing populism in Greece. His critics say the new Conservative government will roll back social welfare programs and push a more authoritarian agenda.
No, I don't think so. Mr. Mitsotakis is quite liberal and moderate for letting his party further drift in the right. I think and I hope that we will have a government that will be based on the political center right rather than ultra-right. I don't see that happening.
In an election with few surprise results, the far-right vote was the exception. In 2015, Golden Dawn was the third largest party in the Greek parliament. This time around, it didn't even secure enough votes to win a single seat.
Having Golden Dawn reaching almost 1/3 of the percentage that it had back in 2015 can only be regarded as a very positive and encouraging sign.
An indication, perhaps, that Greeks may also want to limit any radical reforms to the economy. Melinda Nusifora, The Newsmakers, Athens.
Well, joining me now from Athens is Dimitris Keridis, who's a newly elected member of parliament with the now ruling New Democracy Party, and Dimitris Rapidis, who's a representative of the Syriza party, which just lost power He's also the founder of the think tank Bridging Europe. Good to have you both on the program. Dimitris Rapidis, why did you lose?
Well, we may say a lot of, there are many explanations why Syriza lost these elections. The first that we could say is that the party, the government, despite the fact that it managed to stabilize the economy, to bring it back to a recovery track, it didn't manage to alleviate as much as possible the negative consequences of a decades-long austerity crisis in the country. We did have an improvement in all major social and economic indicators, from poverty to social justice, from the strengthening of welfare states.
Okay, undoubtedly, but if it was that great, they would have re-elected you, right? I wonder, do you have any regrets that you didn't stay radical or didn't stay as radical as you should have been? Do you have any regrets that you accepted the bailout cycle and the conditions of the Troika and didn't go with the opinions of the masses when they had the referendum vote? Do you feel that maybe you compromised too much and that made you lose the next election?
Well, I believe that we were as radical as we could in a very conservative and restrictive framework within European Union and Eurozone. I think that the third bailout was imposed in the country, but despite that, we did manage to bring some positive results. And as you said before, yes, we did lose, and there are many explanations. We also have the Greek electorate has been exhausted by so many years of austerity, from which Syriza has to be blamed for the last 3 years. Also, we didn't manage to focus on different social groups, mainly on the middle class. And this was also one of the major reasons why finally they didn't support us as much as we planned in these elections.
Okay, and it's good to have your honesty and self-analysis there. Dimitris Keridis, let me ask you, why did you win in a nutshell?
Because we expressed the popular will for a change of course. Stabilization is not the stagnation that Syriza kept Greece in for the last 4 years. They missed all their growth targets. The expected growth close to 3%, they underperformed massively. And overall, Greece did very poorly the last 4 years, while Europe grew during those good 4 years, between 14 and 18. Nea Demokratia, New Democracy, expresses the will of the people who want a change of course, a pro-growth, pro-business, pro-investment strategy. And we managed to express that through our Prime Minister now, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, in a very confident and persuasive way. Syriza spent the first 6 months of its government during those the adventurism of a radical break with Europe. It had to then compromise massively. We had to pay the consequences heavily, more than 80 billion euros. Greece sent a message that populism can be defeated with the right policies. We see a return to normalcy.
So let's get a response from Dimitris Rapidis. Was populism your downfall?
About Syriza, about the government?
Yes.
Not at all. I don't believe that populism is the right term. I do believe that we didn't we didn't deliver as much as we have, as much as the public was expecting from our side. I do believe that we did have many wrongdoings in our policy making, but at the same time, I do believe that we did inherited a completely bankrupt economy, and New Democracy has a big part for this situation, governing the country along with the socialists for more than 30 years. So if we want to have, a comparative analysis of which party did better comparing to the other ones, its contenders, we could easily say that Syriza in only 4 years delivered a lot of things, a lot of positive things for the Greek economy and its society.
Dimitris Keridis, have you read what Yanis Varoufakis had to say about your victory?
Yes, and
Okay.
it will be very interesting to see those two former allies fighting each other.
Okay, this is going to be interesting. So, this is too delicious not to share with our viewers. He wrote it on his blog, his website. He's going to be sitting across the aisle from you in Parliament, I guess, because his party has 9 seats, as far as I understand. Let's have a little read of this. Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the new prime minister, is a scion of one of the dynasties responsible for Greece's perpetual bankruptcy, corruption, and subservience to the Atlanticist oligarchy without borders. Tellingly, he has surrounded himself with, on one side, apparatchiks connected to vulture funds and failed banks, and on the other, ultra-nationalist former fascists. Well, besides that, Mr. Keridis, I'm sure he thinks you guys are very good guys. That is a scathing criticism. Your response?
Well, Mr. Varoufakis was brought to Greece from Australia through another dynasty, the Papandreous. He was very close to the Papandreou family. In those days, he didn't have a problem. Of course, he is responsible for closing the Greek banks. The bank holiday of 2015 has his signature, as he was the Minister of Economy at the time. And we still in Greece have capital controls because of his 6-month term in government. In those days, Mr. Tsipras was saying that Mr. Varoufakis is his big asset and his big weapon against Europeans. Today, they are fighting each other and for the radical populist votes. Of course, the Greek people have very much left this whole era behind. They only gave 3% to Mr. Varoufakis, and they are embracing the new era of growth. Let me remind our viewers that Greece had returned to growth in 2014 and had balanced its public finances. It was Syriza who returned Greece to recession in 2015 and 2016. And of course, Syriza, although he didn't govern the previous 40 years until 2010, is very much responsible for the bankruptcy of Greece, because as an opposition, it was always in favor of more spending, whereas the old parties would spend 1, Syriza would have asked to spend 10. And so the idea that Syriza is somehow innocent of Greece's derailing is preposterous. And it's a narrative that nobody buys in this country, except for the Syriza apparatchiks.
Right. I want to ask Dimitris Rapidis, one of the criticisms that the former finance minister and former Tsipras and Syriza ally, Varoufakis, has. He says that you guys enabled the Conservatives. You guys made this possible because the right wing was essentially dead from the center-right to the further right, and you guys made it possible for them to come back and win now. Address that for me.
Well, to begin with, I believe that Varoufakis as a finance minister was the worst possible option, and it proved to be such a negative man for the country, for Syriza, for the economy. Tsipras acknowledged that, and he many times did say that, yes, I did a mistake by choosing Varoufakis for this delicate position. So as of what Varoufakis is saying about the conservative upsurge, I do believe that he's absolutely wrong. Varoufakis, generally speaking, he's good in theory. He's good in his criticism on the Eurozone structure and the necessary reforms we need to do. But about Greece, he has proved to be not as good as...
But what you're saying, Dimitris Rapidis, what you're saying about Varoufakis, right? You're essentially also saying about Syriza in opposition. Because you guys were great in theory in opposition as well. It was, let's give the Europeans a bloody nose, to hell with the Troika, it's our sovereignty, our independence, we don't want to be in this austerity cycle. And then you had to govern and things were a little bit different when you were in the room at the table and you had the responsibility of governing, right? So isn't Varoufakis just a manifestation of you guys in opposition, and it's very different in leadership, and maybe it's better for you guys to be in opposition, isn't it?
Not at all. This is the story of the first semester. What we are saying between January and July 15 was completely different when this had to be applied in our mandate, which is that from September 2015, that the Greek electorate renew our mandate to govern and implement a harsh austerity program, but at the same time to implement parts of our pro-social program. We did manage on the one side to take Greece outside the bailout, the memoranda, and at the same time to keep the society, to give a society a hope that we can build on better days in the years to come. Well, as I said before, yes, we did manage to do some good things, but we needed to do much, much more to survive in the government. Although, as I've seen written behind in your story, Syriza actually lost, but it only lost 4% of its vote comparing to September 15. So it's not such a big defeat.
Okay. Interesting times, because I guess a lot of people are feeling relief as well that Golden Dawn is out. They had 7% last time and 2.93% this time. They just missed the 3% threshold. So the neo-fascist, neo-Nazi group Golden Dawn not in parliament anymore. Dimitris Karidis, there was a lot of suffering when I went to Greece and visited and spoke to people. A lot of young, smart people, multilingual, very well qualified, without jobs. A lot of people engaging in unnecessary suffering. What's your immediate plan? What's your first plan of action in order to revive the economy?
Firstly, let me make a comment about you media, and I mean international media. I don't usually comment on the media, but I have to say that Varoufakis is a media creation up to a certain point, and an international media creation. He has enormous access compared to his very small size and very small constituency here in Greece, in media like your television or CNN or BBC. And it's interesting to see how much interest he creates outside Greece and not inside. He only got 3%, and he's the smallest party in parliament. Just to give you a proportion, we should be talking about the other 97%. Now, our immediate plan is, and already the markets are voting for the new government. We have a tremendous increase in the Greek stock market and a rapid fall in the interest rate of the Greek 10-year bond. This creates a very favorable environment for the new government to upstart the economy, and we want to invite investments. Syriza has stopped, blocked, through incompetency, through ideological blindness, stereotypes, a number of big investments like the Hellenico real estate development in Athens, the Greek gold up north, the biggest industrial investment in Greek history, the Costco Piraeus port development, and so on and so forth. So we want to create a much more favorable environment for investors, foreign and Greeks. We want to do away with the capital controls in the banks. We want to bring down tax rates. And we want to bring in more tax revenues through growth rather than through killing the middle class and the productive capacity of the economy. And this is a very sensible, economically sensible plan through agreement with our creditors in Europe and partners.
Yeah, and it's a massive task ahead. Dimitris Rapidis, is the cold, harsh reality that the Troika would much prefer the center-right government to deal with, whereas there was maybe the unpredictable element with Syriza? Here, they're very happy to look at the Harvard credentials and to look at the Western institutions behind the center-right technocratic elements in this new government, and they feel we can do business with these guys rather than the radical lefties of Syriza.
Let's see if this is the case. From our experience between 2012-2014 during Samara's government, this was not the case. This was not also the case even before 2010-2015, where New Democracy was part of the coalition government. I cannot see why New Democracy can be the good guys, a good allies, or the good students for our European partners. I do believe that comparing to what they have done during 2010-2014 and what we have done, we did during those last 4 years, I do believe that we did succeed. Finally, the numbers speak. We did succeed to take the country outside the bailout, to stabilize the economy, to bring in investments. Numbers also show this, to lower unemployment about 10% from 28 to 18 almost, and to try to create, the minimum safety nets for the most vulnerable groups, and at the same time create the conditions for our young people to come back to our country. So we actually, with Mr. Keridis, we are actually seeing two different realities. And I do believe that in the next 4 years, or in the years to come, we will see which strategy finally succeeded.
Okay. Dimitris Keridis, are you willing to concede that they did some good things and you're building on some of those foundation blocks?
Not really. Samaras in 2012 got an economy minus 9% growth and turned it to 1% growth, 10 percentage point difference in 2 years. Syriza got this 1% and leaves it with 1.3%, one of the lowest in Europe. And of course, investment in Greece is down in 2018 compared to 2017. It's the usual misrepresentation from Syriza, which the Greek people do not buy. It is true that no matter what I say, what Mr. Rapidis say, the markets count, and the markets have voted since the Euro elections in May. They have renewed the confidence in Greece, and it is true that Mr. Mitsotakis does not need an 80 billion euro lesson and to go through a Varoufakis phase in order to realize how the economy works, what globalization means, what European politics is all about. Mr. Tsipras has cost the country very, very dearly, and he will be judged by history, if not by the Greek people. Already he has been judged in a very negative terms. I think those 80 billion euro episode of 2015 will always follow him and Varoufakis, as much as he's trying now to distance himself from Varoufakis. It is entertaining, but it doesn't work.
Okay, well, people will be keeping a close eye on Mitsotakis, and I don't think the Greek people will be giving you guys too much time before they want to see results being delivered.
We have no time.
Yeah, and that's going to be fascinating.
Run very fast.
Right, okay,
Yes.
and looking forward to having you guys back on the program to take stock of where we are with the economy and the politics of Greece. It's always fascinating. Good to talk to both Dimitris.
Thank you.
Today, Dimitris Keridis and Dimitris Rapidis. Thanks for joining us. Immigration reform. It's a major topic on the US campaign trail. And during a debate last month, the Democrats running for president took Donald Trump to task. But while many condemned Trump's detention centers, long-shot contender Marianne Williamson took a step back. She suggested that the immigration crisis could partly be blamed on US foreign policy and that nobody on stage was willing to bring that up. So we've decided to take up the mantle. In the next few moments, we'll look at America's history of supporting coups and unfair trade policies. And we'll ask whether that's contributed to an environment which has forced millions to seek a better life in the United States. Let's begin the discussion with this report by Adam Pletz.
If families make it across the Rio Grande alive, they face the prospect of being forced apart and held in overcrowded, squalid camps. And the officers they encounter on the way aren't always the most sympathetic. Leaked posts from a secret Facebook group for US Border Patrol agents depict crude and offensive images of immigrants and left-wing lawmakers. It's the latest in a series of scandals relating to the treatment of migrants on the US-Mexico border. Treatment that's been condemned at the highest levels.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is utterly appalled by the conditions of detention of migrant children and adults in the United States. And in the worst of circumstances, it can amount to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law.
But with poverty, crime, and gang violence rampant in Central American countries, the prospect of a better life continues to draw the tired, the poor, and huddled masses.
I want to get to the United States to improve my life, because in Honduras, my mother was searching for a job but didn't find one.
For decades, the US has intervened in Latin America, successively fighting the Cold War through proxy forces, the war on drugs, and propping up several right-wing authoritarian leaders. In recent months, Washington has supported the opposition in Venezuela against its socialist government, threatened tariffs against Mexico, and withdrawn aid from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. It says all 4 countries must do more to reduce emigration from their territories to the US. In response, Mexico has deployed more security forces to its borders, which it says has been effective.
There's been a reduction in migration flows by this national force, and it's been recognized by other foreign governments.
Critics, however, say the root causes of migration have little to do with Mexican negligence, but rather years of poor policy making in Washington. And that's led to weakened states, rife with corruption, and in turn, unchecked criminal gangs who take advantage of the poor.
It's true that the government can't ignore what's happening to the migrants because drug traffickers and people traffickers are laughing at the Mexican government. They're using these poor people, these very migrants, to transport their merchandise.
Indeed, drug smuggling has been one of President Trump's main arguments for building a border wall. But ultimately, did America create these problems for itself? And if so, might the solution lie more in a change of policy than a controversial border wall? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Jim Jatras. He was a U.S. diplomat in Mexico and a senior foreign policy advisor to the Republican leadership in the Senate. Also in D.C. is Democratic National Committee woman Yasmin Tayeb. She came to the United States as an undocumented immigrant and is now running to become a state senator in Virginia. And finally, in New York is Ravi Ragbir. He's a leading activist for immigration rights and currently faces deportation from the United States, even though he's called the country home for 3 decades. Good to have you all on the program. Yasmin Tayeb, let me start with you. We look at the situation on the border. It is undoubtedly a political crisis. For many, it's a humanitarian crisis as well, especially from the perspective of the left. But is it also a crisis that needs to be solved at the root causes in the northern triangle of Central America, where the United States needs to maybe look at its own actions in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for having me on today. You know, as you noted, what's happening right now at the southern border, but globally, we're in the midst of the worst refugee crisis ever. And when we're talking about what the U.S.'s responsibility is, and specifically in addressing our own actions and decades long of years of intervention that the U.S. has had in countries such as El Salvador, in Honduras, and Guatemala, countries that are now plagued by violence, families and children who are fleeing violence and poverty. The responsibility of the United States is simply to abide by our own domestic and international obligations. It's simply noted that it is a legal right for those that are at our borders to be able to file for asylum. And right now we have tens of thousands waiting, and this is the crisis that we need to be talking about and addressing.
Okay, so Jim Jatras, people would look at the Middle East and maybe they can make clear correlations and causations. They can say, well, U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 caused a whole lot of trouble, and that's why you can see a refugee crisis, from Syria and beyond. It's somewhat clear. Is it as clear to you, as somebody who worked within the system, when we talk about the Central American countries and people moving up for a better life to make it to the United States? Is it as clear as the Middle East?
I don't think so. I think there's certainly an element of that, and I certainly would be a critic of many aspects of American policy, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And let's remember, we have now people showing up at our border who are not necessarily from Latin America. We have Africans, for example, showing up and crossing illegally into the United States as well. I don't think we can reduce it to that, however. When you hold up what is essentially an attractive nuisance to say, look, if you cross the border illegally, you will be taken into the United States, you might be held temporarily, and then we're going to let you go and see whether or not you show up for your hearing to adjudicate your claim of asylum. And of course, a lot of these people, in fact, most of these people will not show up. We're basically saying the welcome mat is out. If you can get to the United States, you can stay. And I think that is really the main contributing factor here, that people say it's doable, I will improve my life measurably coming from a country that's poor, that's got
Right.
violence of various sorts, and I think it's now uncontrollable.
Okay, I'm going to bring you in, Ravi, in a second. But in addition to Jim, I want you to hear from Senator Lindsey Graham in response to that horrible image we saw of a father and child washed up on the border. Have a little listen to Senator Graham.
Asylum claims should be made in the home country or in a facility in Mexico, because the reason he tried to go across the river, he was told by people in Central America, if you can put 1 foot on American soil, you're home free.
Go, Ravi.
So I have to disagree with Jim on many points he tried to make. One, there is direct correlation to what happens in this Northern Triangle and the reason why people are coming here. You look at the recent U.S.-backed coup in Honduras with elected President Zelaya, who was ousted. With the reason people are not leaving because of poverty. I mean, if you look at Nicaragua before Ortega went crazy, Nicaragua is one of the lowest, has the highest poverty level. Yet people were not fleeing Nicaragua until the violence started. There's a lot of violence that is in the Northern Triangle, which was created by the U.S. You look at the drug policy, the drug war on drugs that they instituted in these areas, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. You look at the way they intercede in the politics of the country. And we talk about policies of foreign policies, but it's not just about foreign policies, but about U.S. interests in private interests, which the U.S. backs. So even we work with a lot of asylum seekers who have fled the Northern Triangle, who are saying that there's a land grab. The indigenous people who live on the coastline are being their lands are being taken away from them, and they have to flee because they either face death or not. Okay. But let me make two quick points, right? Jim talked about people crossing illegally. That is not happening. People are actually trying to go to CBP and request asylum. And when they do come across, it is not that they don't show up for the hearings, but the fact is that ICE and USCIS are not given the right dates and times for the hearings. People are confused, including lawyers, including organizations who work on this for many years. They don't know what is happening because no one is getting correct information to literally make the system difficult for everyone to traverse.
Jim?
Look, I don't know where to begin with this. I would agree with many of the aspects of criticism, as I said, in our policy in Central America and other places in the world. I very rarely, by the way, agree with Lindsey Graham on anything. If the contention is that there are private interests located in the United States, and this goes back many decades, that help create instability in some of these countries, I'm entirely willing to agree with that. However, it does not then follow that we have an obligation to allow anybody who is displaced or has trouble in his own country to come into the United States and end up staying permanently in most cases, and because we have some kind of penance to live down for having been a contributing factor until these countries at some point in the future become a paradise where people prefer to stay home rather than come here. It's interesting to me that the same plutocratic interests that are at work in destabilizing some of these countries are themselves very strongly in favor of open borders, of bringing foreigners in. We think of the Koch brothers, for example, who are essentially open border libertarians. So I think the ones who get hurt in this is in the American economy, American taxpayers, American job seekers who are basically forced to pay the bill for bad policies, but the solution to that isn't say, y'all come in, but the solution to that is you put up a wall and say you don't come in unless you come in through proper legal criteria.
Jim, I wonder what you think about this new bill, H.R. 2615, being tabled in Congress, the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act, to support the people of Central America and engage with these countries there. Isn't that an admission within Congress, even though the Democrats have tabled this, Elliot Engel's the sponsor, isn't this an admission that, okay, beyond whether conditions are bad, and conditions are bad, I mean, objectively, they're terrible on the border, beyond that, we need to do something deeper and further back because this is unsustainable. Would you accept that something's fundamentally wrong?
I'm not sure it's an admission, and I would not be particularly optimistic that this bill will do anything good. Again, we seem to have two kinds of policies toward the world. For our friends, we have all sorts of aid programs that generally don't do all that much good, to tell the truth. And for our enemies, we have bombs and sanctions, and they don't do much good either. I would think that if we were smart, which we're not, we would be thinking in terms of what the Chinese are doing with their Belt and Road Initiative throughout Eurasia. We should be looking at ways to try to integrate and build the infrastructure throughout the Western Hemisphere and actually help in a partnership with these countries. I don't think this bill will do that.
Okay, some interesting ideas there. Yasmin Taib, at the start of the year, when there was a government shutdown, the Democrats were saying this is a manufactured crisis from Trump. No, this is nonsense. There's nothing really happening on the border. Trump is manufacturing this. Do the Democrats need to do a bit of soul searching now and say that we got this wrong because there was a crisis? Because now you have the same Nancy Pelosi who's saying we're going to table bills and we're going to protect migrant children. 7 months ago, she was saying there's no crisis. Trump is just using it for political purposes.
It was a manufactured crisis because this administration was...
Go ahead, Yasmin.
This administration, sure. So this administration was calling little children refugees and asylum seekers and families that are trying to seek a safe haven in our country. He was referring to them as criminals, as members of gangs. He absolutely was a manufactured crisis. What we need to do right now as a party is we need to ensure that the U.S. lives up to what it's always been, and that's a welcoming country, a country that has always welcomed refugees. Our refugee resettlement program has traditionally been a bipartisan program. It's not a program that has been so politicized until this administration. This administration has not only gutted our refugee resettlement program, has effectively shut down the asylum process completely. When we're talking about, and Ravi had mentioned this, that the thousands of families and children and mothers and fathers who are at our borders right now, at ports of entry, trying to legally apply for asylum, the reason why they're absolutely crossing into the Rio Grande and losing their lives is out of desperation. It's not because they're simply trying to come here because they think it's easier here. They're doing it out of desperation to save their own lives. They've been waiting and waiting for months and months. The blame is solely on this administration because he's not even, again, abiding by our own domestic laws and international obligations.
Ravi Ragbir, I want to get your thoughts on something that might seem to be a small issue, but I want to fold it into this because I wonder if you think it's part of a broader systemic culture when it comes to this issue. News broke a few days ago. There was a ProPublica investigation about Facebook groups of Border Patrol agents saying very racist and terrible things about the people that they were processing and blocking and so on. Do you believe that there's something bigger and broader at play here when it comes to the U.S. and its perception of people trying to come in?
Well, when you look at the way they treat immigrants, migrants, children, families, everyone who has been living here for decades or people now coming in, and the only way you can justify the treatment of immigrants is to dehumanize them. So if we are made less than human, it makes it easier for them to do their job, to push, to exile people, to traumatize people, to terrorize people, because this immigration policy. So I want to say this policy didn't start with this administration. This immigration law is racist, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about the 1996 law that was signed by a Democratic president, who was Clinton, that allowed or created the situation we're in right now. And then all the bringing together Department of Homeland Security. So when you see these posts are literally for them to be able to stop their conscience from acting, because if they treat people like these, they in this way, and they're less than human, they are animals, they are not real. It makes it okay for them, because no matter what, every one of those officers have a speck of humanity in them. And we, as New Sanctuary and the work we do, believes that we can touch that humanity.
Right.
And if we can touch that humanity, it changes what is happening.
One final geopolitical question for you, Jim, and not going that far south, not looking at Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala, but looking at the immediate neighbor, Mexico. Trump saying the Mexicans are not doing anything, not doing enough. The Mexicans are saying we're doing the best we can. Is it a fight worth picking right now, where the president is not on good relations with the Mexicans because they're the final country that these migrants have to pass through before they reach the United States?
I'm not sure it's a particularly good strategy, but I think the options are somewhat limited. As was mentioned at the introduction of the program, I served as a consular officer in Mexico. This was some time ago. But I recall in those days, the Mexicans were absolutely ruthless when it came to policing their border in a way that we never have been along our border. They were quite violent, quite repressive with people crossing illegally from Guatemala. And I don't think it's because they were racist. Ravi raised the racism card, which is the typical one that is used here. And I think that the Mexicans felt, and I think they do today, that La Patria, their fatherland, is an important thing, and it needs to be protected. If we, however, as Americans feel that our country needs to be protected, and whether all of these people are desperate refugees, and I don't think they necessarily are in a lot of cases, how many are we obligated to take? 1 million, 2 million, 10 million, 100 million? There are a lot of very desperate people in the world, and at what point do our interests as a country, just like Mexico or Japan or any other country or Turkey, come to the fore, and they say, it's all very sad about what goes on in the rest of the world, but we have our own country to think about. We cannot accept all of these people.
Okay, well, I think there are about 50 layers to this story, and we've peeled back about 5. So I'd love to have you all back on the program sometime soon, because the story is not going away anytime soon. But for the moment, I have to move on. Jim Jatras, Yasmin Tayyab, and Ravi Ragbir, I thank you all for joining us on The Newsmakers.
Our planet is going to face disaster if we don't turn this ship around. And so it's basically like there's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult. And it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question. You know, is it okay to still have children?
U.S. Congresswoman Alexandra OcasioCortez is sounding the alarm over having children while the world is facing a climate crisis. It's given a big voice to a small movement of women known as Birth Strike, led by activist and musician Blythe Pepino. The group is made up of people who say they've made a conscious decision not to have kids. Some members believe the global population needs to decrease, while others don't want to bring a child into a world that faces rising temperatures and the consequences that come with it. Well, with us now is the founder of the Birth Strike movement, Blythe Pepino. She joins us from Calais, France. Good to have you on the program, Blythe. You don't want to bring children into the world. In a sentence or two, why?
The world is disintegrating, and I think over the next 5 years is going to be very interesting in terms of what happens, but it's also very important for everyone to be all hands on deck. And if I'm having a baby, then I'm breastfeeding 20 times a day. I'm getting 2 hours sleep a night. It's not really my focus at the moment. And that's mainly because I feel like I have to be an activist. We really need a revolution. We need to change our leaders. And so that's my personal reason for not having a child at this time.
Okay. All hands on deck to do what?
Well, I think, you know, in a sense, our time has entirely run out. So the only thing that we can do, I think, as a species is attempt the unimaginable, which is to unite internationally. We need to have a revolution. We need to get rid of leaders who have brought us to this position and who are stalling. And we need systematic change to our energy systems, our agricultural systems, to our economic beliefs. And so, yes, we need,
Right.
ultimately, we need a revolution.
Okay, so what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I understand it, you're saying that you need to prioritize and we all need to focus our energies on reversing climate change and reversing where we're headed, presumably because of climate change. Therefore, having a baby should be a secondary priority. You're not saying that having a baby makes things worse, are you?
Yeah, there's two things wrong with what you just said. So one is that there isn't a should in birth strike. We are just presenting our own personal choices, and we're not saying that the world itself or women across the world should take this up as necessarily their opinion. They need to make their decision according to what they believe. So we're not a coercive group. We don't believe in trying to get people to do the same thing as what we're doing. We're just raising the profile of the problem. The second thing that you said is that people are doing birth strike to reduce population, to reduce the carbon footprint on the planet. Some people in birth strike are doing that, but birth strike as a whole is not, that's not the purpose of the group. The purpose of the group is to get onto channels like yours and to talk about the fact that we are facing an inevitable civilization collapse at this point.
Yeah, regardless of religion, political ideology, philosophy, a fundamental driver for the species seems to be to procreate, to make more babies, to survive, right? That's not just us, it's all other species. With that in mind, is it difficult to convince people that an option is to opt out and not have kids?
Again, we're not trying to convince anyone to do that. What we're trying to say is that a bunch of us have made this decision because we've reached the point where we would normally, in a normal life, we would be thinking about having children, and actually this isn't an option for us because we've chosen a different route. So we're not trying to convince anyone to do the same as us. But what I am finding is that people all over the planet are making this decision for various reasons. A lot to do with the reason that I've spoken about, because they feel that activism is really important, and a lot because I think a lot of people are troubled by the kind of the effect that would have on the planet, but also the effect that it would have on their kids. So people are really worried about the safety of their children in the near future. We're talking about really new, we're talking about decades here. We're not talking about centuries.
Okay, what kind of news would you need to hear over the next 2, 3, 4 years in order to convince you that perhaps you can continue your activism while being open to the idea of having a child as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. It's actually all about community for me. So I would have to see the very idea of people's a sense of community shifting away from this individualistic capitalist idea, a career-driven, growth-driven mindset, to an understanding of our limitation as a species, an understanding of the need for real equality, not just mythical equality, and a movement towards that in a real way. So we would need to see huge changes, systematic changes to how our economics is done, how we are talking about growing food, how we're talking about sharing the wealth of the world, so that like you say, the poorest countries that are going to be hit first and worst are reparated for that.
Any countries in the world where you see them as a model to follow?
I'm very excited by New Zealand. I think Jacinda Ardern is a very exciting leader. Just the very fact that we can hear the words that they're using to describe a new economic model, that they are thinking about people's well-being before profit, is an exceptional thing to hear in this day and age. And I'm very, very excited to see how that goes. But I'm also interested to see how the rest of the world, we are living in a global world, how the rest of the world reacts to that, and whether actually that's enabled by the international community.
Right. And it's interesting because even a country like New Zealand, a country like Sweden, Norway, the Scandinavian countries, who seem to be doing things pretty much okay. I mean, they have welfare states where they're looking after their citizens, but thriving economies and so on. They're telling their citizens, make babies because we need a young, vibrant, working population in order to keep a thriving country, because we don't want to have too many old people on benefits and we don't want our population to die off. So does that give you a kind of paradoxical solution as to what needs to happen here?
Yeah, I mean, the greying population argument that you've just spoken of is actually a lot less of a problem than people realise. There was a really good study that was done in 2014 into population numbers, and one of the things that they had a look at was the likelihood of the stress of a greying population if there aren't so many children coming up. And actually, because of the changes in the way that women would then have time to put into care work, it actually doesn't create that much of an issue.
Okay, Blythe Pepino, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, sharing power in Sudan. Military and civilian leaders join forces, ending a standoff that brought the country to a standstill. But will it work? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.